He wasn't rushing. He didn't look over his shoulder. He wasn't fidgeting or trying to avoid eye contact. Jalen Carter walked into Belmont Jewelers the way any 17-year-old might. Nervous, hopeful, a little unsure of what he could afford. He had a folded envelope in his back pocket, filled with crumpled bills and coins he had saved over 3 months working weekends at a coffee shop. His sister's birthday was coming up, and all she ever talked about was a charm bracelet she saw in a magazine. Jalen didn't know much about jewelry, but he knew what it meant to give something that said, "I see you." Inside the store, the lighting was soft and expensive. The glass counters gleamed. Classical music played quietly from hidden speakers. Behind the counter stood Margaret Whitmore, neatly dressed, pearl earrings, her reading glasses hanging from a chain. When Jalen stepped through the door, she glanced up. Just a second too long, just long enough for him to feel it. That pause, that narrowing of the eyes, it wasn't surprise, it wasn't curiosity, it was calculation. Jalen approached the counter and spoke politely. He explained what he was looking for and mentioned his sister's birthday. Margaret didn't smile. She didn't lean in like she had done with the couple before him. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, and said, "Do you have a budget in mind?" It was a simple question, but her tone made it sound like a challenge. Jalen pulled out the envelope and carefully placed it on the glass. He had counted it twice before coming. $137, stacked in small bills and coins. He also brought a printed payslip from the cafe, just in case anyone thought a teenager couldn't possibly have that kind of money on his own. Margaret stared at the bills. Then at Jalen. Then back again. "And where did you say you got this money?" she asked. There it was. No effort to hide the suspicion, not even the courtesy of phrasing it gently. Jalen, trying to stay calm, explained about his job in the cafe. He even mentioned the manager's name, hoping it would make a difference. Margaret looked unimpressed. For older viewers watching this, there's something familiar in that moment. Maybe they've lived it. Maybe they've seen their sons or grandsons live it. A moment where you realize you're not being seen as a customer or a neighbor or someone's child. You're being scanned like a risk. Jalen didn't raise his voice. He didn't push back. He pointed to a charm bracelet in the display case, something simple with a silver heart. Margaret hesitated, then unlocked the case and laid it out. He held it gently, turned it in his fingers, and just as he was about to hand it back, it slipped. The bracelet hit the floor with a soft clink. Margaret's reaction was instant, but that comes next. The bracelet hadn't broken. It simply landed on the carpeted floor, untouched, undamaged. Jalen bent down to pick it up, careful not to make any sudden movements. But Margaret had already taken a step back. Her arms folded, her jaw clenched. It was as if the sound of metal meeting floor had triggered something deeper than concern for store property. She looked at him now not as a clumsy teenager, but as a threat. "You need to put that down," she said firmly. "I was just handing it back," Jalen replied, his voice even. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached under the counter, pressing something. Jalen didn't know if it was a silent alarm or just a security button, but the air in the room shifted. Something unspoken had been decided. She had made up her mind about him, and nothing he said was going to change it. Older viewers recognize that look. It's not new. It's the same look black men and boys have seen walking into banks, at apartment lobbies, or even their own neighborhoods. It's not about what you do. It's about who they already believe you are. Margaret narrowed her eyes and asked again, this time slower, "Are you sure you didn't bring that bracelet in with you?" The words hit like ice. "What?" Jalen asked, genuinely stunned. "I didn't see you clearly when you walked in. It's possible you had it on you. Some kids like to pull tricks." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, tucked inside polite phrasing. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of her insinuation landed hard and unmistakable. Jalen opened his mouth, but then paused. Part of him wanted to explain, to prove again that he had saved every dollar, to show the receipt from his paycheck. But part of him realized she wouldn't care. She had already filed the report, in her mind. She just needed someone to come and make it official. Margaret stepped back again and picked up the store phone. "I think I need assistance," she said into the receiver. "Yes, I've got a young man here who's acting aggressive, possibly attempted theft. Aggressive. It's a word that has followed black boys for generations. It doesn't mean raised fists. It doesn't even mean loud voices. Sometimes it just means standing still and existing in the wrong place. Watching this unfold, many older viewers may feel a heavy kind of frustration. A memory resurfaced, a scar retouched, because they've heard the same words used in the same tone by people who held the benefit of the doubt for everyone, except them. Jalen stood quietly. He didn't protest. He didn't run. He just looked at the floor and whispered, "I just wanted to get my sister something nice." But the decision had already been made, and someone was already on their way. The doorbell chimed faintly as Jalen stood frozen near the display case, still holding the payslip in one hand and the folded envelope in the other. He didn't know whether to stay or walk out. His eyes scanned the room, looking for a camera, a witness, anything that could later speak on his behalf if words failed him. Margaret was already narrating a version of events over the phone. Her voice remained calm, but deliberate. "Yes, he's still here. No, I haven't asked him to leave yet. He's being watchful." She paused, letting the implication settle, then added, "He dropped something, and when I asked questions, he became defensive." None of it was true. Not really. But each sentence was just far enough from a lie to sound believable. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse directly. She simply curated a tone that suggested she was in control and under threat at the same time. Jalen knew what that meant. He had seen enough news stories, enough phone footage, enough names. He thought about the ones who didn't make it home. And suddenly, the charm bracelet felt irrelevant. To the older viewers watching, this is the moment that hits hardest. Not because of its drama, but because of its familiarity. They've seen how fast a quiet afternoon can turn into a news headline. They've raised sons and grandsons and taught them to keep their hands out of their pockets, to never talk back, to announce every move. Not because they did something wrong, but because someone might believe they did. Margaret hung up and looked at Jalen, her arms still crossed. "You should stay right there," she said, as if her word had the weight of a judge's gavel. "I didn't take anything," Jalen said quietly. Her response came like clockwork. "Then you have nothing to worry about." But they both knew that wasn't true. Jalen put the payslip on the counter slowly, as if placing an offering. "You can keep that," he said. "It's got the cafe number and my name." Margaret didn't reach for it. Her eyes stayed on him, studying his stance, his posture, as if she were trying to memorize details for a report. He backed away from the counter slightly, kept his hands visible. "Can I call my mom?" he asked. But Margaret didn't answer. She just glanced toward the door. Outside, a squad car pulled up. Its lights weren't flashing. There was no siren, just the sound of tires stopping on wet pavement. Inside the store, the silence was thick. Jalen turned his head slowly, watching the outline of two officers exiting the vehicle. One of them adjusted his belt. The other tapped something into a notepad. Neither looked in a rush. But that was the danger, wasn't it? It didn't take force. It didn't take shouting. Sometimes it just took a voice on the phone saying, "I feel unsafe," and a uniform ready to believe her. And now they were here. The bell above the door jingled softly as the officers stepped inside. Sergeant Blake entered first, broad-shouldered, mid-50s, a presence that filled the small showroom with quiet authority. Behind him walked Officer Doyle, younger, maybe late 30s, his eyes moving from Jalen to Margaret and back again. Neither officer placed a hand on their weapon. They didn't have to. Their presence alone did what Margaret had hoped for. It shifted control. Blake didn't ask any questions. He didn't greet Jalen or assess the situation. His first words were procedural, spoken like a script. "Step over here for me, son." Jalen didn't move. "I didn't do anything," he said. Blake took a slow step forward. "I'm not going to ask again." It was Margaret who filled in the blanks. She began to speak, measured, calm, describing what happened in a tone that suggested restraint, like she was holding back worse details. She said the young man dropped an expensive bracelet. She said he became agitated when questioned. She said she felt threatened. That word again. Officer Doyle listened, but his face showed something else. Doubt, maybe, or discomfort. His eyes flicked to Jalen's hands, still open and in plain sight, holding nothing. He glanced at the counter, saw the envelope, the payslip, the unbroken bracelet now placed neatly beside it. But Doyle didn't say a word. To older viewers, especially those who wore a badge themselves or knew someone who did, this scene carries weight. It's not always the loud officer who causes the most harm. Sometimes it's the silent one, the one who sees, understands, and still does nothing. The bystander with power, the witness who lets things slide. Blake reached for the handcuffs. "Turn around," he said. Jalen's voice cracked. "Can I call my mom?" Blake didn't respond. Doyle cleared his throat. "Sarge, maybe we should ask a few questions first." Blake shot him a look. Not angry but dismissive. The kind that says, "This is routine. Don't complicate it." "Standard procedure," Blake muttered. "We'll sort it out at the station." Jalen felt the cold steel close around his wrist. At that moment, it wasn't about the bracelet anymore. It wasn't about whether something was stolen. It was about assumption turned into action. Authority exercised without pause. A boy marked guilty before the story even unfolded. Margaret watched from behind the counter, lips pressed together. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. But there was no remorse in her eyes either. Just distance, detachment, like she had successfully handed off a burden to someone else. And that's what many older viewers will recognize too well, the ease with which someone can shift blame, start a fire, and walk away from the smoke. Jalen didn't resist. He didn't argue. But his shoulders were tight, his breathing shallow. He stood not as a suspect but as a child who realized that in some rooms his truth wouldn't matter. Then a voice came through the door. It was calm, commanding, familiar, and it stopped everything. "Take your hands off my son." The voice cut through the room like a blade. Not loud, not rushed, but sharp, deliberate. It carried the kind of weight that silences small rooms and freezes busy hands. Sergeant Blake turned first, his grip still firm on the handcuffs. Officer Doyle stepped back slightly, instinctively. Standing in the doorway was Simone Carter. Her blazer was navy blue, crisp and pressed. A badge hung from her neck, gleaming under the showroom lights. Her face, calm but unreadable, gave nothing away. She walked forward with measured steps, heels clicking against the tile, eyes fixed on Blake, not even glancing at Margaret. "Not yet." "Uncuff him," she said again, evenly. Blake blinked, confused. "Ma'am, you were told there was an attempted theft by a minor. What you weren't told is that minor is my son, and I expect you to treat him with the same presumption of innocence you'd give any other teenager shopping in this part of town." Jalen didn't speak. He didn't need to. His mother had arrived, not in panic, not in anger, but with authority built over a lifetime of being questioned, dismissed, underestimated, and rising anyway. To older viewers, especially those who've raised children in a world that too often prejudges them, this was a moment of quiet vindication. A mother, worn by years of caution and preparation, walking into the fire not to plead, but to correct. Simone turned to Margaret now. Not harsh, not hostile, but direct. "You called the police on my son. You told them he was aggressive. You questioned his ability to afford a bracelet he spent 3 months saving for. Did he raise his voice? Did he threaten you?" Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. Her hand reached for the edge of the counter, like she needed something to hold on to. "I felt unsafe," she said at last. Simone nodded slowly. "I'm sure you did, but your discomfort is not evidence of wrongdoing. It's a mirror." She let the words hang. Blake finally uncuffed Jalen, his fingers fumbling slightly. Doyle stepped back, hands behind his back now, gaze lowered. Simone moved to stand beside her son. She touched his shoulder gently. "You okay?" she asked. Jalen nodded, his eyes brimming but dry. "I didn't even get to pick the bracelet," he said softly. Simone looked around the room once more. "That's not the only thing we're going to pick today," she said. To viewers, this wasn't just a moment of maternal protection. It was restoration. A reversal of power without shouting, without violence. Just presence. Just truth, spoken by someone who knew how fragile justice could be and how necessary it was to hold the line. Then she pointed toward the far corner of the store. "Where's the security footage?" Margaret hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward the corner of the ceiling where the small black dome of the security camera hung. For a moment, she didn't move, as if hoping that somehow, ignoring the request, might make it disappear. But Simone had already taken a step closer to the counter. "I asked where the footage is stored," she said again, her tone steady. "It's in the back," Margaret replied, voice tight. "The system saves everything to a hard drive." "Then let's go." Simone said. "We'll watch it together." Sergeant Blake shifted his weight. "Ma'am, I'm not sure that's—" "You're not sure of what?" Simone turned to face him. "That reviewing the only objective record of what happened might ruin your report, or that it might reveal you jumped to conclusions based on nothing but a phone call and a boy's skin?" Blake said nothing. To older viewers who've lived through decades of excuses, these moments feel like justice knocking louder than usual. Not because someone yelled, but because someone demanded clarity. Not because power was challenged, but because truth was finally being asked to speak. Margaret led the way to the small back office, a narrow room filled with filing cabinets and the quiet hum of machines. The monitor flickered to life. She clicked through the timestamps, finding the moment Jalen entered the store. There he was, holding the envelope, smiling politely, speaking calmly. Frame by frame, the video told a different story than the one she'd offered on the phone. There was no sign of aggression, no attempt at theft, only a young man picking up a bracelet, admiring it, and then accidentally letting it slip from his fingers. He bent down to retrieve it, carefully, then stood, still holding the payslip, waiting for her to respond. Simone watched in silence, arms folded. When the clip ended, she didn't speak right away. She simply looked at Margaret, not with rage, but with a kind of tired clarity that many mothers know too well. "You told the police my son was a threat," she said quietly. "But this tape shows what really happened. So tell me again, what were you afraid of?" Margaret didn't answer. Not because she had nothing to say, but because there was nothing left to defend. Officer Doyle, standing behind them, exhaled softly. He looked at the screen, then at Jalen. Something shifted in his face. Not just guilt, but recognition. A delayed acknowledgement of the cost of silence. Back in the main room, the bracelet still sat on the counter. To older viewers, especially those who've spent their lives waiting for evidence to finally be enough, this moment lands hard. The truth was there all along. It didn't need translation. It didn't ask to be believed. It just needed someone to press play. Simone turned back toward the showroom. "I think we're done here," she said, but she was wrong. This wasn't over. Margaret stepped out of the office first. Her eyes didn't meet Jalen's. She walked quickly toward the counter, as if resuming some unfinished task, avoiding every glance, every trace of what had just been shown. She reached for a clipboard, then a drawer, then the edge of the counter again. Movements without purpose, just motion to escape stillness. Simone remained still. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't follow Margaret. She simply spoke. "You called the police on my son for dropping a bracelet. You gave a false report. You used language meant to escalate, not describe." Margaret turned halfway, her mouth slightly open, searching for a response that would soften the edges of what had happened. But there was nothing to soften. Not when the truth had already spoken louder than her tone ever could. "I was just trying to be cautious," she said. Simone nodded slowly. That word, cautious, it gets used so often to justify fear that isn't based on danger, but on difference. To many older viewers, especially those who've lived through the weight of coded language, these words carry more than meaning. They carry memory. The memory of being followed through stores, of being asked for ID while others walked past, of watching suspicion rise the moment they entered a room. They know caution can feel like a cage. Jalen stood to the side now, quiet but watching. Not angry, not trembling, just tired. Simone stepped forward, closing the space between her and Margaret, not threatening, not invasive, just present. "You made a decision," she said. "A decision that could have cost my son far more than an afternoon. You don't get to walk away from that just because you're uncomfortable now." Margaret's voice was lower this time. It wasn't personal, but it always is. Simone didn't answer immediately. She let the silence do the work. Then she said, "Accountability isn't personal either. It's necessary." Officer Doyle shifted again. Blake stood behind him, arms crossed, but his expression now showed the first traces of doubt. For the first time, the room felt unsettled, not because someone had raised their voice, but because someone had raised a mirror. And the reflection wasn't easy to look at. To viewers who have waited years for someone, anyone, to name what was wrong in plain language, this wasn't just confrontation. It was correction, the kind that doesn't ask for apology, but for reckoning. Margaret finally sat down behind the counter, her face blank, the weight of what she had done now too visible to hide behind habit or protocol. Jalen looked at her once more, but didn't speak. He didn't need to. Simone turned toward the officers. "This won't end here," she said. "You both will file reports, and I'll be contacting the department. I want this documented, fully." The room fell silent. Outside, the sky had darkened. But inside, the lights were still on, and so was the camera. Simone stood near the front of the store now, her voice steady, her presence unshaken. She turned to Sergeant Blake and Officer Doyle with the calm certainty of someone who had spent her entire career dealing with systems that claimed neutrality while enforcing bias. "You'll write your statements tonight," she said, "and I'll make sure they're reviewed." Blake gave a small nod, arms still crossed, trying to hold on to a form of authority that had already been peeled back. Doyle looked down, his silence no longer protective, just heavy. Simone looked to Margaret next. "This store may not answer to me, but I will be filing a formal complaint with the Better Business Bureau, and I expect Belmont Jewelers to address what happened here today. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern." Margaret didn't speak. She simply sat behind the counter, hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on a spot somewhere between the floor and the glass display. To older viewers, this part feels like truth finally reaching beyond one room. It's not about revenge, it's about recognition. About naming something aloud so that no one else has to go through it quietly. But Simone wasn't finished. "This won't be buried in paperwork," she said. "There will be a press release. The city deserves to know how its youth are treated in broad daylight. How quickly we go from shopper to suspect. How silence and vague language protect the ones who initiate harm and erase those who endure it." Jalen shifted slightly, standing next to her now, taller than her by a few inches, but still very much her child. His face was calm, but his eyes held the weight of everything that had just unfolded. He hadn't cried, he hadn't shouted, but he'd been changed. To viewers who've watched entire generations grow up knowing they'll need to prove their worth before even being seen, Jalen is not a stranger. He's someone they know, someone they raised, someone they once were. Simone pulled out her phone, typed a few notes, then looked up. "This press release won't just be a line in the local news," she said. "It will include names, badge numbers, timestamps, and facts, and it will go out tomorrow." Margaret finally spoke, voice low and shaky. "I didn't mean for this to get political." "It's not political," Simone replied. "It's personal. It always has been." Outside, the streetlights began to flicker on. Inside, the air had shifted. No one moved, no one spoke. For once, the silence wasn't complicity. It was consequence, and it would not be the last word. The next morning, news spread quickly. The city's press release didn't soften the language. It didn't say an incident occurred. It said what happened. That a young black teen was wrongfully accused. That officers responded without asking questions. That bias shaped every step of the encounter until a camera and a mother intervened. Margaret Whitmore was relieved of her duties. Belmont Jewelers issued a formal apology. Not because they wanted to, but because they had to. Under the scrutiny of public pressure, accountability was no longer optional. Sergeant Blake was placed under review. Officer Doyle, though not disciplined, was required to complete additional bias training, a decision that sparked its own round of debate in local forums. Some called it too light. Others called it a start. Jalen didn't say much that day. He didn't post on social media. He didn't stand behind a podium or give a statement. But when he returned home, he placed the bracelet, still in its white paper box, on his sister's nightstand. She found it later that evening, unwrapped it slowly, and held it in silence. "I didn't know," she whispered to their mother, "that it would take so much." Simone nodded. Neither did he. To the older viewers, who've watched names turn into hashtags, who've held their breath every time a news story began with "a young black man was approached by police," this moment lands in the chest like a quiet ache. Jalen could have been another headline, another name recited, another face on a t-shirt worn at rallies. But he wasn't. Not this time. And it wasn't because the system worked. It was because someone refused to let it break him. Simone didn't ask for praise. She didn't want cameras or attention. She filed the paperwork. She followed through on her word. And when it was done, she sat beside her son on the porch, watching the street below, the hum of life returning to normal. But normal had a new shape now. Jalen looked down at his wrist, where the cuff had left a faint line the day before. It would fade. The memory might not. I keep thinking, he said quietly, how close it was. Simone nodded. Closer than it should have been. He turned to her. And if you hadn't come, she stopped him gently, you shouldn't have to be rescued to be believed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world kept moving. Cars passed. A neighbor waved. The sun dipped behind the row of houses. But something had shifted. Not just for Jalen. For everyone who read the story, who saw themselves in it, who recognized that justice, when delayed, is often denied, and that telling the truth is only the beginning. To those watching, especially those who have felt invisible or judged too quickly, this final image holds power. Not because the fight is over, but because someone stayed in the room long enough to make sure the truth was heard. If you've ever been judged for how you looked before anyone listened to what you said, remember this. Truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to arrive on time. Type 1, if you've ever felt powerless in the face of authority. Type 2, if you still believe integrity can make a difference.